Mitra Pembangunan, Lead Advisor Governance and Inclusive Growth, GIZ, Mr. Philip Johansson, Komisioner KPK periode 2015-2019, sahabat saya ini Bapak Laude Muhammad Syarif, Direktur Jenderal Penegakan Hukum Kementerian Lingkungan Hidup, pejabat struktural KPK, rekan-rekan pegiat anti korupsi, dan hadirin sekalian. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sehat, salam bahagia, shalom, om swastiastu, namo buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Bapak sekalian, hutan sebagai kekayaan alam Indonesia merupakan kesatuan yang utuh dalam sistem kehidupan bermasyarakat dan bernegara. Dalam hutan yang berfungsi sebagai ruang publik dan penyangga kehidupan, misalnya, budaya dan peradaban lahir menjadi cara pandang bangsa tentang bagaimana rahmat sumber daya alam tersebut dimanfaatkan secara adil, adil bagi sesama maupun untuk masa yang akan datang. Visi bangsa inilah yang dituangkan dalam Konstitusi Undang-Undang Dasar 1945 Pasal 33. Dalam cita yang demikian, hutan seharusnya dipandang sebagai kekayaan negara terbesar. Kondisi saat ini, Bapak-Ibu sekalian, menjelaskan bahwa praktek penguasaan hutan yang ada justru melupakan bagaimana hutan seharusnya sebagai bagian dan membentuk sistem hidup bangsa Indonesia. Ketimpangan pengelolaan dan watak kebijaksanaan sumber daya alam yang otoriter, kelemahan dalam tata kelola, dan ketidakpastian hukum berkelindan dengan salah satu musuh bangsa terbesar abad ini, yaitu korupsi. Berbagai permasalahan yang terjadi dan terpapar saat ini seolah memberikan hipotesis bahwa pasal 33 Undang-Undang Dasar 1945 ini telah dikorupsi. Penguasaan ratusan juta hektar luas kawasan hutan belum sepenuhnya manfaat hutan dapat menjadi jalan kemakmuran bangsa dengan cara yang adil dan bermartabat. Dari total 41 juta hektar lebih lahan hutan yang dikelola, hanya 1% yang diberikan kepada perusahaan skala kecil dan masyarakat adat. Bapak-Ibu sekalian, di sisi lain, kerusakan hutan, deforestasi, kebakaran hutan, dan lahan terus terjadi dari tahun ke tahun. Tidak hanya berdampak pada kerugian ekonomi, tetapi juga menjadi beban langsung yang harus ditanggung oleh 80 juta masyarakat yang hidup dan menggantungkan hidupnya dari hutan. Buruknya pengawasan menyebabkan negara didera kerugian hingga 35 triliun rupiah per tahun akibat pembalakan liar. Analisis KPK menemukan bahwa kelemahan pengawasan dalam izin pinjam pakai menyebabkan terjadi potensi kehilangan penerimaan negara bukan pajak, PNBP, akibat pertambangan di dalam kawasan hutan sebesar 15,9 triliun rupiah per tahun. Ini baru data di Kalimantan, Sumatera, dan Papua saja. Ditemukan 1052 usaha pertambangan dalam kawasan hutan yang tidak melalui prosedur pinjam pakai. Resiprokal dengan buruknya tata kelola tersebut, korupsi menjadi penyakit yang tumbuh subur di dalamnya. Dalam kajian perizinan KPK tahun 2013, membuktikan ulang bahwa kebijakan pengelolaan sumber daya alam sangat rentan dengan korupsi. Dengan metode Corruption Risk Assessment, CRA, KPK melakukan analisis terhadap 21 regulasi yang mengatur pemanfaatan hasil hutan kayu dan penggunaan kawasan hutan. 18 regulasi diantaranya rentan korupsi. Akibatnya, setiap bisnis proses perizinan tersebut penuh dengan suap, konflik kepentingan, perdagangan pengaruh, pemerasan, bahkan state capture corruption. Kajian sistem PNBP Kehutanan tahun 2015 menemukan bahwa 77 sampai 81% laporan produksi kayu tidak tercatat di Kementerian Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan. Akibatnya negara harus menanggung potensi kerugian negara dari PNBP, Provinsi Sumber Daya Hutan, dana revitalisasi sekitar 5,24 sampai dengan 7,24 triliun rupiah per tahun selama periode kajian, yakni tahun 2003-2014. Sementara itu, potensi kerugian negara dari nilai kayu komersial yang tidak tercatat sebesar 12 sampai dengan 16,8 triliun rupiah per tahun. Bapak Ibu sekalian, upaya pemberantasan korupsi di sektor kehutanan menjadi perhatian utama sejak KPK berdiri. Melalui proses penindakan, setidaknya sudah ada 27 kasus yang ditangani KPK yang sudah berkekuatan hukum tetap. Berbagai upaya pencegahan korupsi melalui perbaikan tata kelola sumber daya alam dilakukan KPK. Melalui Gerakan Nasional Penyelamatan Sumber Daya Alam, GNP-SDA, KPK mendorong perbaikan sistem dan regulasi, monitoring kepatuhan pelaku usaha, koordinasi dan supervisi permasalahan lintas kementerian, lembaga, dan pemerintah daerah, serta breakthrough dan debottlenecking permasalahan lintas kementerian, lembaga, dan pemerintah daerah. Namun demikian, perjalanan masih panjang untuk dapat mewujudkan tata kelola sumber daya alam yang berkepastian hukum, berkeadilan, dan bebas dari korupsi sehingga amanat konstitusi bisa terwujud. Sinergi dari semua pemangku kepentingan menjadi kunci. Oleh karena itu, kami mengucapkan terima kasih kepada U4 Resources Center dan GIZ atas dukungan dan kerjasamanya, khususnya kepada para peneliti U4, Dr. Sophie Skuter, Dr. Jackie Becker, dan Monica Kirya, sehingga 3 studi pemberantasan korupsi di sektor kehutanan bisa diselesaikan pada tahun ini. Yang pertama, penanganan kasus korupsi kehutanan di Indonesia, pembelajaran dari penuntutan oleh KPK, Tackling Forestry Corruption in Indonesia, Lesson from KPK Prosecution. Yang kedua, jaringan korupsi di sektor kehutanan Indonesia, Corrupt Network in the Indonesian Forestry Sector. Dan 3, mendorong pendekatan sensitif gender untuk memberantas korupsi di sektor kehutanan, promoting a gender-sensitive approach to addressing corruption in the forestry sector. Semoga studi ini bisa memberi pelajaran bagaimana upaya-upaya pemberantasan korupsi bisa lebih dikembangkan ke depan, sehingga bisa meningkatkan efektivitas pemberantasan korupsi di sektor sumber daya alam, khususnya kehutanan. Terima kasih juga kami sampaikan kepada pemerintah Jerman, yang selama ini telah mendukung upaya pemberantasan korupsi di Indonesia melalui program Assistance in Preventing and Combating Corruption di KPK sejak tahun 2007 sampai dengan sekarang. Tidak lupa pula terima kasih kepada pemerintah Norwegia atas dukungannya dalam program peningkatan kapasitas penegakan hukum di bidang sumber daya alam, lingkungan hidup dari tahun 2019 hingga tahun 2021. Dan juga kepada masyarakat sipil, CSO, akademisi, pusat studi atas kontribusi dan dukungannya dalam pemberantasan korupsi dan penyelamatan sumber daya alam di Indonesia. Semoga ke depan sinergi antar kita bisa ditingkatkan untuk sama-sama mewujudkan Indonesia yang lebih baik dan bebas dari korupsi. Demikian kami sampaikan atas kerjasama dan perhatiannya. Saya mengucapkan terima kasih, selamat sore, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Kami mohon maaf, kami tidak bisa terus mengikuti acara ini karena ada acara gelar di ruang sebelah. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Alex.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.
Bapak sekalian. Ya.
Terima kasih Bapak Alexander Marwoto. Selanjutnya, kajian kerjasama antara U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center dan KPK tentang korupsi di sektor kehutanan ini merupakan dukungan dari pemerintah Republik Federal Jerman. Untuk itu, kami mempersilahkan Duta Besar Republik Federal Jerman untuk Indonesia, His Excellency Dr. Peter Schuff, untuk menyampaikan sambutannya.
Terima kasih, everybody. Hello, selamat sore. I hope everybody can hear me. I would speak briefly about our contribution. Dear Bapak Alexander Marwoto, KPK Commissioner, thank you for your opening remarks. Dear Ambassador Vegat Kale, Vegat, long time no see. I hope we will meet in person soon again. Dear Claude Sharif, Commissioner of KPK between 2015 and 2019. I still remember our very good meeting that we had shortly after I arrived in Jakarta. Dear Ms. Sophie Schütte, Deputy Director of the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center. Mr. Horacio Rido Sani, Director General of Law Enforcement at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. Dear Philip Johansson from GIZ, dear representatives of other government institutions and the international development partners of Indonesia, and of course, good afternoon all other viewers. In 1999, Germany, along with Norway, the Netherlands, and UK, was one of the founders of the U4 Anti-Corruption Center. Now, U4 is obviously inspired by U2, which is a famous rock band, but U4 makes it even better. The name comes from the city, Vegat will explain this much better than I can, of the city of Utstein, near Stavanger in Norway, and they called it the Utstein Partnership U, which is very much alive today, and we have actually managed to grow and now comprise 9 countries to date, also Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Switzerland, Australia. U4 is now a globally active player, and we are very happy that we can have this partnership with Indonesia, where a lot of work is done. Let me just say a couple of more general remarks. Germany looks at Indonesia as a global development partner, which is a relationship that is not only the usual donor-beneficiary relationship, but we look at Indonesia as a partner in advocating the cause of fight against anti-corruption and all other global issues at the global level. So that is why we have Indonesia as one of our 5 privileged global development partners. And environment, climate protection, of course, is a very important one. As far as German assistance here is concerned, we have a flagship project called ForClim, which stands for the protection of forests. Over 40 million euro have in the past been available through projects by German Development Cooperation to improve forest management and governance. And this is indeed crucial to promote the inclusive, transparent and sustainable use of the most valuable woodlands of Indonesia, some of the most valuable in the world, to provide local communities with opportunities for stable and legal livelihoods. And at the same time, forest protection, protecting, of course, the unique biodiversity that you have here in Indonesia. Indonesia has made a lot of progress fighting deforestation. From roughly 1 million hectares deforestation in the El Nino year of 2015, it dropped to about a third in 2019, 324,000 hectares, which is still a lot, but of course, compared to what happened 4 years before, it constitutes a significant progress, and it's a huge success. The enemies of good forest governance is corruption, just like with good governance in general. Unfortunately, in this context, most forested areas in Indonesia, elsewhere in the world, are quite remote, and corrupt practices, if they happen, are hard to monitor there. This makes the work of U4 and Indonesia in this regard and other corruption watchers all the more important. It is also very important that Indonesia has taken the fight against corruption with its very own, very resourceful agency, the KPK Corruption Eradication Commission. We, from the point of view of German development cooperation, have been collaborating with both the Corruption Eradication Commission, KPK, and also, as you know, with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, KHK, for many years, and I highly appreciate, and I would like to express this here also in front of so many viewers, this very fruitful cooperation with these very important institutions. We have, I think, as far as our cooperation with KPK is concerned, achieved together with our assistance, our support, that we try to render 3 very important milestones. One was the concept development of the so-called KPK whistleblower system. The other one was the development of the so-called Jaga apps for reporting corrupt practices. And the third one was the program of certified anti-corruption trainers, which has produced more than 800 trainers so far, including, of course, experts in the forestry sector. In this spirit, and against this perspective, with this solidified structure in the anti-corruption area, we have now decided to start at the beginning of this year an operation of improved forest governance in the provinces of Papua and Papua. And we base this work on the valuable experiences from many other locations in Indonesia, such as Kalimantan or, as a matter of fact, Sulawesi. Our work in Papua and West Papua has started at the beginning of this year, 2020, with a budget of 3.25 million euros for technical cooperation. It was, of course, what I would call a soft launch, because in March, as of March, COVID-19 intervened and everything had slowed down a little bit, but we work with a number of NGOs to fight corruption in the forest sector, also in Papua, in a number of important areas. The first thematic area, it's called AMAN. It stands for Transparent, Participative, and Inclusive Decision and Policy Making, safeguarding the indigenous people's rights. The second pillar we work on is Citra, which is the capacity development of the public sector and of non-government actors in preventing corruption in the forestry sector through transparency, something that is very important, as all you anti-corruption experts know. And the third field we are focusing on is Indonesia Corruption Watch, other issues such as promoting public-private dialogue and a compliance system for good practices. Our common objective in all this with strong partner institutions is to help reduce illegal deforestation. One important message for us today is, as you said before, Commissioner, we help to prevent financial losses of state institutions through corrupt practices. The Indonesian state benefits from our joint efforts, even if certain actors get bad publicity and possibly heavy sanctions in the short term. So the Indonesian state benefits from KPK. This is a very important message to make again and again from our point of view, also in the Indonesian public. In the case of forest conservation, in addition to financial sustainability, it also contributes to maintaining biodiversity and reducing also carbon emissions, because they are also an important outcome of our joint efforts. So, to sum up, we are very glad that we can be a partner of this esteemed UFOR Anti-Corruption Resource Center. We are very proud to be present today at the launch of the joint studies on combating corruption in the forestry sector. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the staff in KPK, the commissioners, but also all the other colleagues, as well as the staff, of course, of GIZ and the experts who have worked so long in this field, for making our cooperation a success. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih, His Excellency Dr. Peter Schoof. Selanjutnya, Norwegia adalah salah satu mitra UFOR yang menjadi tuan rumah Christian Michelsen Institute di Bergen dan mendukung anti korupsi di sektor kehutanan Indonesia. Maka hadir juga bersama kita hari ini Duta Besar Norwegia untuk Indonesia, kami mengundang His Excellency Vegard Kool untuk menyampaikan sambutannya.
Good afternoon. I do hope you can hear me clearly. Honorable Commissioner of the Corruption Eradication Commission, Mr. Alexander Marwata, Your Excellency Peter Schoff, Ambassador of Germany, Excellency Pakla Ude Sheriff, and the distinguished guests. It is an honor to be here, albeit virtually. Research is one of the foundation of our society. Research guides observation and learning, and through the use of new knowledge, we develop and improve. Human beings have throughout history searched for new knowledge and wisdom. Seek knowledge even if you have to go as far as to China, as Prophet Muhammad said. So it is in a long tradition of knowledge seeking. I would like to start by recognizing everyone who has made the studies on anti-corruption in the forestry sector possible. A special thanks go to the organizers, JSET and the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center, Murdoch University, and particularly to Indonesia's Corruption Eradication Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, UNODC World Wildlife Trafficking Report 2020 observes a dramatic increase of more than 10-fold in some cases of illegal wildlife trades, including illegal logging and trading of rosewoods. The same report also reveals organized crimes invested significantly in efforts to conceal their activities and tracks. Despite improvement in control, new identification methods and intelligence resulting in global success in operation and seizures, which provide insights about what happened regarding the volume, routes and trade, and profits made from these activities remain in general unknown. The consequences of these crimes are huge. Friends and colleagues, we know that corruption and illegal activities thrive in the dark, in organizations and systems where information is hidden or contradictory. Transparency and disclosure of information are therefore efficient tools when fighting corruption. Today, there are large amounts of information available. We have access to advanced technology and we are closely connected so that information and technology can be shared. Despite this, improvement in transparency does not seem to move as fast and as broad as we expected. In fact, in some cases, the deeper we dig, the darker it gets. I'm therefore pleased to learn that the studies we are launching here today employ a new method, a new way of seeing things. The studies and analysis of illegalities do not longer stop at figures and actors, but rather extends the analysis to network functions and interests and their link to enable corruption. I believe this approach will help us make new connections and improve our understanding and why and how illegalities, corruption in particular, occur. This new knowledge will be put to good use when protecting our environment, but also our democracies through well-informed law enforcement. Let me end by pointing to Norway's long-standing partnership with the government of Indonesia on climate and forests. During my more than 3 years of working in Indonesia, I have witnessed so many positive results and improvements in land use and forest governance. Anti-corruption and enforcement of environmental laws are amongst the most progressive sectors. I'm confident this progress will continue for the benefit of the government, the environment, and most importantly, the people of Indonesia. So once again, I would like to congratulate KPK, JSET, U4, and other partners with today's launch, and reiterate that Norway stands ready to continue our support. So thank you very much for your attention.
Terima kasih, His Excellency Mr. Vegard Kool. Selanjutnya, Pemerintah Republik Federal Jerman menunjuk GIZ sebagai pelaksana program kerjasama dengan KPK di bidang pencegahan korupsi sejak tahun 2007. Untuk itu, kami mengundang Mr. Philip Johansson, Lead Advisor Governance and Inclusive Growth, GIZ untuk memberikan informasi tentang program kerjasama KPK GIZ di bidang pencegahan korupsi. Kami persilahkan.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this opportunity to briefly present you the background and the role of GIZ in this cooperation,
untuk
which was
menyampaikan
outlined
mengenai latar
by all of
belakang
you
dan
beforehand.
peran
So,
GIZ
Commissioner,
di sini.
Ambassador,
Saya ucapkan terima kasih
I could see the second
kepada
slide.
Komisioner KPK dan
As
juga
Ambassador Schof has
Bapak
already
Duta
disclosed
Besar.
the background of the name U4,
Dan
I would also
sebagaimana
like
yang
to
Bapak
share
Ibu
that
lihat di sini
GIZ
pada
actually
slide
stands
ada
for Deutsche
background,
Gesellschaft für
dan
internationale
GIZ adalah
Zusammenarbeit mit beschränkter Haftung.
lembaga
But I think we can all
di negara
agree to use
Jerman,
GIZ here today in
dan
the
kita akan
session.
menggunakan istilah GIZ
Could we
saja
maybe
meskipun
forward to
ada
the next slide?
kepanjangannya. Baik Bapak Ibu, kita lanjutkan dengan slide berikutnya.
So, to clarify, in the sake
Untuk
of
menjelaskan
accountability and transparency,
sedikit
GIZ is a
terkait dengan
non-for-profit
accountability
private sector
dan
entity owned by the
kewajibannya,
Federal
GIZ
Republic of
adalah
Germany.
lembaga swasta nirlaba yang dimiliki
So
oleh
it is not a donor, it is
Republik
not an
Federal
NGO,
Jerman.
not a foundation, not a consulting company, but exactly that, a limited liability company, and is actually used as a service provider in the field of international cooperation for sustainable development. And as such, GIZ works obviously worldwide in many partner countries, and here in the case of Indonesia since 1975, on behalf of the German government, specifically the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, but also other institutions. The project that we are talking about here concretely today has already been mentioned. So Assistance in Preventing and Combating Corruption, APCC. And this is actually our currently, I think, longest running project since 2007, of course, with a partner of the KPK. But many other organizations, state and non-state, are also involved in this joint bilateral project as well. The current project is commissioned by the German government for 3 years, as it is usually the case. And this one started in January of 2019 and ends in December of 2021. And it was already outlined that we work obviously on the national level towards better corruption prevention, but also specifically on the subnational level with partner provinces here, Papua, West Papua, and East Kalimantan. Next slide, please. So while this project that is ongoing at the moment will come to an end in December of next year, both governments have already agreed to extend the cooperation. So in last year's government negotiations in Berlin, it was agreed that a new project will be commissioned already now for the January 2022 until December of 2024. And here the geographical focus will be exclusively on the two provinces of West Papua and Papua. And again, the topic is improved forest governance. As was also already mentioned, this bilateral project, APCC, is not a standalone project, but it also works very closely with the four-climb assignment, which again is implemented jointly through the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, KLK, and GIZ. And for those that maybe do not have direct experience working with GIZ, our modalities that we offer are advisory services. So the capacity development, organizational development of our partners is the top priority. So we do not have standalone project structures, but everything is very much embedded in the partner institutions, like in this case, the KPK. We also offer very specialized technical assistance. Ambassador Schof already mentioned the Jaga app, for example, as I think a very appropriate technological solution to this challenge of corruption. We also work with various non-state actors, and again, the various specific non-governmental organizations were mentioned. But we also work with other think tanks, universities, also business associations like Kadin and Apindo, wherever we can help to bring non-state actors together with the local or even central government, we reach out. And last but not least, access to dialogue platforms, be it on the local, regional, or international level. And last but not least, also joint organization of events like this one here today. Yes, next slide, please. So the specific background of the cooperation between GIZ, KPK, and U4. The project that is currently ongoing was designed in the framework of an appraisal mission. So during this mission, all parties already agreed to have a joint cooperation in this domain. And the specific purpose was to see if the U4 Anti-Corruption Research Center could help to increase the research and analytical capacities of the KPK. Again, with the overall objective that there's a better coordination between prevention and investigation. So now we see that U4 supports the KPK in this field of knowledge exchange and to provide tools to improve the evidence-based methodologies within the Indonesian anti-corruption policy. And one example is that U4 works with the KPK on applying very advanced research methodologies in the KPK's archive of case files, which I think is a very important element of this. And we might learn more about this later today. So this launch is, of course, the platform to present the outputs of this cooperation, which have already been published both in English and in Bahasa Indonesia as U4 issues. And specifically, it is about the promotion of gender-sensitive approaches to eradicate corruption in the forestry sector. Then the second point, handling forest corruption cases in Indonesia, lessons learned from the prosecution processes by the KPK. And last but not least, corruption networks in Indonesia's forestry sector with the title Politics and Pulp in Pelalawan, Riau province. So again, thank you so much for this opportunity here today, and I wish us all a fruitful exchange. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Mr. Philip Johansen. Selanjutnya, kami mengundang pimpinan KPK periode 2015 sampai 2019, Bapak Dr. Laude Muhammad Syarif, untuk menyampaikan informasi tentang bagaimana latar belakang kerjasama U4 dan KPK selama ini. Kami persilahkan.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador, Ambassador Norway, Ambassador Germany, friends from U4, and of course, Pak Alexander Marwata, and Bapak Dirjen Penegakan Hukum Kementerian Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan. First of all, I would like to thank the support from both the Embassy of Germany and the Embassy of Norway and GIZ specifically for their support to the implementation of this project. This project was initiated during my terms when I was in a KPK because I see several important documents sitting within the KPK file, but not yet used for many other purposes. Even it is actually not used by some directorate within the KPK because it is stored, for example, within research and development unit, and sometimes also some file cases within the prosecution departments also not shared with other unit within the KPK. Therefore, when actually trying to understand it, and because I have a specific personal interest on the issue of corruption in natural resources sectors, that I'll try to find a way how to use those files and to use those hidden germs of information within KPK to be used not only for the KPK themselves, but also can be actually distributed or used by, for example, educational institutions, other law enforcement agencies, and relevant ministries such as Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and of course several others governments institutions in Indonesia. Aware of that, when I met Sophie from U4, that I we had this communication. First, it was informal communication because Sophie used to work in Kemitraan, my previous office before I joined the KPK. And also she's been actually assisting KPK in the past. And now I am going back to Kemitraan. And that's why we developed this some kind of similar understanding about the importance of specific studies, looking at the network of corruption in KPK, network of corruption in natural resources management in Indonesia, and also looking at some cases prosecuted by the KPK. And we do hope that this study will be used to improve the management of natural resources in Indonesia, especially on forestry sectors. And at the same time, it will improve the quality of KPK prevention program and of course KPK investigation and prosecutions works. From what we've learned from the 2 or the 3 studies, I think there are a lot of need for some kind of room for improvement for the KPK. For example, as I wrote it here today on Tempo newspapers, I see that some prosecution of a KPK actually focusing on the branch of the trees. It's not in the root or the big chunk of the trees. Of course, sometimes it is difficult to prove corruption cases up to the top level of corporation. But I think in the future, we have to focus on the root of the corruption, not on the branch of a corruption itself. And also, I do hope that the cooperation between the KPK, the other independence organization outside Indonesia, and of course within the Indonesia, and the cooperation with relevant ministry, especially the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. I think it is very, very important to learn from this study, how so that we can actually improve on several aspects of natural resources management. For example, and I think the most important one is on the accountability and the transparency of licensing system. Because if we look all corruptions cases prosecuted by the KPK always involve the licensing process. That's when all corruption cases actually started. And of course, another lesson that we can actually learn from the study are, for example, there were several licenses obtained because of corrupt practices, because they actually bribed, the corporation bribed several officials and they get that license. But even though the culprit has been sent to jail, those licenses still valid and actually still used up to date. So that's why I think in the future, the KPK need to improve its prosecutions so that to include also every licenses obtained through illegal activity should be invalidated by the court. I think this is for another project in the future, but I think this is very, very important how to assist relevant government officials, especially the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and of course the Ministry of Energy and Mining and Natural Resources. I think that's all from me. And again, I would like to thank KPK, U4, GIZ, and Norwegian Embassy for their continued support and trust to the KPK. And I do hope that the current leadership within the KPK will continue to focus on this corruptions in natural resources, because this the source of the money on the country. And it is also important because corruption in natural resources is not only sacrificing the current generation, but also sacrificing the right of our kids and future generation. Thank you all. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Bapak Laude Syarif, selalu menginspirasi ya Bapak. Baik, hadirin sekalian, kini kita akan memasuki sesi talk show dari 3 hasil kajian kerjasama KPK dan U4. Dalam sesi talk show ini, pertanyaan akan diajukan oleh para moderator. Jika hadirin memiliki pertanyaan dan ingin tahu lebih dalam lagi, akan ada sesi diskusi teknis yang akan diselenggarakan pada tanggal 24 dan 25 November 2020, seperti yang tertera di dalam undangan. Dan akan diakhiri dengan penyampaian secara resmi rekomendasi hasil studi kepada pimpinan KPK pada tanggal 27 November 2020. Untuk itu, sesi talk show pertama, kami mengundang moderator Ibu Yuyu Andriati Iska dari KPK dan juga Miss Monica Kiria, Senior Advisor dari U4, yang juga adalah peneliti dalam studi literatur tentang mendorong pendekatan sensitif gender untuk memberantas korupsi di sektor kehutanan. Kepada Ibu Yuyu, kami persilahkan.
Oke, terima kasih Rere. Selamat sore Bapak dan Ibu semua, baik yang mengikuti diskusi ini melalui live Zoom maupun di YouTube KPK. Selamat datang di sesi pertama untuk diskusi hari ini dengan topik mendorong pendekatan sensitif gender untuk memberantas korupsi di sektor kehutanan. Saya Yuyu Andriati dari Biro Humas KPK akan menjadi moderator dalam diskusi ini. Jadi seperti tadi disebutkan oleh Rere bahwa narasumber untuk sesi kali ini adalah Dr. Monica Kiria. Saya akan memperkenalkan sedikit latar belakang Monica Kiria yang akan memaparkan hasil penelitiannya pada sore hari ini. Oke, Monica adalah seorang lawyer, khususnya di bidang hukum dan pembangunan, dan bergabung dengan U4 pada tahun 2016, serta mengkoordinasikan tema di U4 tentang pengarusutamaan anti korupsi dalam penyampaian layanan publik dan pemaduan gender dalam program-program anti korupsi. Kemudian Monica mendapatkan gelar Bachelor of Laws dari Makerere University dan juga Postgraduate Diploma dari Uganda Law Development Center, Magister Hukum dan Pembangunan dari University of Warwick, Inggris, dan juga PhD dalam bidang hukum. Saat ini Monica mengajar di Universitas Makerere dan menjadi dekan hukum di Universitas Cavendish Uganda. Monica adalah konsultan eksternal juga untuk berbagai NGO internasional dan memberikan bantuan-bantuan teknis tentang hak asasi manusia, pengarusutamaan gender, dan reformasi hukum. Itu sekilas mengenai Monica. Saya akan memberikan waktu, seperti tadi disebutkan oleh Rere, bahwa dalam talk show kali ini tidak ada tanya jawab. Jadi saya akan memberikan waktu kepada Monica untuk memberikan penjelasan mengenai hasil penelitiannya, yang tadi topiknya adalah pendekatan sensitif gender untuk memberantas korupsi di sektor kehutanan. Jadi seperti kita tahu, ini pasti bahasan yang sangat menarik, pengarusutamaan gender dalam sektor kehutanan. Korupsi di sektor kehutanan memicu deforestasi yang dampaknya sangat merugikan masyarakat, terutama untuk perempuan. Jadi meningkatnya kesetaraan gender di bidang kehutanan ini bisa membantu untuk mengurangi korupsi dan juga degradasi hutan. Selengkapnya saya akan mempersilahkan Maria untuk menjawab beberapa pertanyaan tujuan dari penelitian ini dan kemudian apa yang dicari dengan penelitian ini dan temuan-temuan dalam penelitian ini serta nanti rekomendasi yang akan diberikan setelah mendapat hasil dari penelitian ini. Waktu dan tempat saya persilahkan, Monica.
Thank you, Yayak. Honorable KPK commissioners, Your Excellencies, the ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much to all of you. I'd like to thank especially GIZ and KPK for giving me the opportunity to be part of the C-Files project and to be part of undertaking this very interesting research study. So what was the aim of the study? The study was meant to review the literature and establish whether there was a link between gender and corruption in the forestry sector. We define gender here as the social roles and responsibilities attributed to men and women. The other aim, of course, was as a result of the findings of the study to propose some recommendations that policymakers and practitioners in KPK and other government agencies in Indonesia and indeed in other countries dealing with similar problems can use to try and address this issue. Next slide. So the methodology that I adopted for this study was to do a non-systematic review of the academic literature, as well as the gray literature, that is reports, books, and other documents from NGOs, government agencies, and multilateral agencies. What did I find when I reviewed the literature? First of all, I could find no studies on gender and corruption in the forestry sector. And I believe that this is the first paper to try and establish this link. There are many studies on gender and corruption and several on gender in the forestry sector. There's also a lot that has been published on corruption in the forestry sector. And by looking at all these groups of studies, we can draw some conclusions and try to see whether we can see some questions for further research. Can you go back a couple of slides, please? That one, thank you. So I thought I would start by highlighting some of the key issues from the studies on gender and corruption, since this is ultimately about what does this mean for the forestry sector. So when we look at the literature on gender and corruption, we see that the research in that area has been carried out in various fields. From the field of economics and political science, the findings show a strong link between female or women's participation in public office and the control of corruption. More specifically, the studies show that increasing the number of women in public office correlates very strongly with improved corruption control. Another significant finding in this area is that political power in many countries, if not in all countries, is dominated by men, and women are excluded from patronage networks and from running for office or even being appointed to public office due to sexism. From the field of gender and development studies, we find that women suffer the effects of corruption more than men. The corruption affects women more negatively because of two main reasons. First, because of their caregiving responsibilities in families and the fact that they are responsible for looking after the health of all family members, preparing food, sometimes growing the food even, collecting water and using it for various purposes in the household. These duties that women bear means that they often, first of all, have to interact more with social services and government officials who work in these services, and sometimes demand bribes when they do. For instance, in the forestry sector, women from forest communities who encroach on protected areas can face demands for cash or sex bribes from forest guards and rangers. In the field of psychology, several psychological experiments have proven that women are less likely to cheat than men, that they are more likely to cooperate, and that they are more averse to taking risks. And lastly, from the field of anthropology, we have a slight twist and interesting findings. Anthropology is the study of human culture, and one study on Ghana showed that men and women in public office show no significant difference in their likelihood of demanding for bribes. Next slide. So if we, as I said before, I approached this research by looking at various strands of literature. And one of the things that I looked at is corruption in the forestry sector. There's quite a lot of research that has been done in this area. And when we look at this area, we see that most of the corruption that happens in this sector manifests as illegal logging. And illegal logging is, of course, facilitated by collusion between public officials and logging companies, and often involves bribery. Another type of corruption that happens in forestry is embezzlement of funds that have been set aside for the development and conservation of forests. My research also showed that in some countries, including in Indonesia, there's a form of corruption known as elite capture. This is when local leaders, for instance, in the case of Indonesia, the village leaders, they make sure that development programs benefit themselves and their families, leaving out other members of the community. We also see, as I said before, that sometimes women in forest communities face demands for bribes or sex when they encroach on forests and are caught by forest guards and rangers. The impact of forestry corruption on women and even on men is more indirect rather than direct. It's linked to illegal logging and the resulting deforestation. Deforestation decreases men and women's access to the timber and non-timber products that they get from forests. It makes it harder for women who rely on the forest to feed their families. When trees are cut down, women must walk longer distances to fetch firewood, and this impacts on the time that they have to do all the many things they have to do, and of course it impacts their health negatively. Deforestation causes soil erosion, which has a severe impact on food security, makes it difficult for women who are responsible for food production to grow food. Soil erosion also contaminates water sources, which means that often women have to walk even further to look for clean water. And lastly, illegal logging deprives governments of much needed revenue, which they could invest in social services such as health and education that would greatly improve the lives of women and their families. Next. When we look at the field of gender and forestry, the research there was interesting because it reveals how men and women use forests differently. And one of the most interesting things there is that men use forests mostly for things from which they can make money. Things like fishing, logging, mining, hunting sometimes, and that women mostly use forests for subsistence or home use. That means the products they collect are not usually for sale, but to improve their lives and those of their families. We find that as some forest activities become more commercialized, men frequently take over. For instance, in some countries where nuts used to be collected by women, but soon gained commercial value, such as Brazil nuts, then men took over that activity and began to make money from it. We also find in some countries that both men and women are involved in certain activities, such as tree nurseries, such as charcoal making, which is often illegal. They're also both involved in artisanal mining and wood processing. It's important to note, of course, that the levels of men and women's involvement in all these different forest activities vary from country to country and from region to region. But overall, we see that there are some significant gender differences in how men and women use forests. The research, next slide, please. Research also looked at the issue of gender and forest governance. Now, although women are severely affected by the effects of forestry corruption, unfortunately, they are often not involved in forest governance. Most of the people who work in the forestry sector are men, and women are usually excluded from decision making. Forestry committees may include women, but their participation is often not meaningful, and sometimes they are not given the chance to say anything during meetings or have their views taken into account. We also find that many of the forestry development programs were sometimes designed in a way that didn't take gender differences into account, but this is starting to improve. And we see, for instance, the Red Plus program starting to take into account the importance of gender, as well as the EU Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Initiative, who are conducting research on women's participation in the forestry supply chain and trying to see how women can be more involved in the forestry sector. So this shows that even though women have frequently not been involved in forest governance, things are starting to change, and most of the actors in this sector now recognize how important it is to include women. I'd like to add here that for me, the most important finding that I obtained from this research was that involving women in forest governance greatly improves forests. This comes from research in India and Nepal, which showed that when women are involved in forestry committees, forests regenerate really well. They show really good canopy, and they are leafy and green and really healthy. I think this is one of the things that definitely struck me the most from this research. So how do we summarize all these things? Next slide. We see some negative things happening with regard to gender and the forestry sector. Yes, as I've said, women are usually excluded, and sometimes there's elite capture in forestry projects. We see that there's illegal activity such as illegal logging, charcoal burning, which involve men and women to varying degrees. We see women being sextorted sometimes by forest guards and rangers. The negative effects of forestry corruption on men and women, but mostly on women due to their caregiving roles. And we see that sometimes anti-corruption initiatives threaten the livelihood of forest communities, especially women, if they are not conducted in a gender-sensitive manner. This happens when certain areas of the forests are degazetted as protected areas, and forest communities, members of these communities who are women wander into them, then they can face negative effects. We see also some really positive things coming out of the research, as I've already mentioned, how involving women improves forests. We see that women are already playing a very key role in the environmental movement. There's a big movement called the Green Belt movement in Africa, started in Kenya by Wangari Maathai. Many years ago, we had the Chipko movement in India, who actually gave rise to the phrase tree huggers, because they actually embraced trees to stop them from being cut down. we see women playing a role in the fight against corruption. And SPAC Indonesia is one of the most famous and well-known women's movements against corruption in the world. So we see that women are already well placed to take a leading role in reducing corruption in the forestry sector. And government actors, international actors recognize this and are already making efforts to involve women in the forestry management and forestry supply chain. So I think from all that, we can see that promoting a gender-sensitive approach would reduce corruption in the forestry sector. And what can be done about this? There are some recommendations that I believe KPK and other government agencies should take into account. First of all, I think you should make it part of the law that women and men should all participate in forestry bodies. It should be a requirement under the law. The forestry department and other concerned bodies should recruit more women, empower them to participate meaningfully. What does this mean? For instance, at village committee level, it means that women should be invited to meetings, but meetings should also be held at times that are convenient for women. It means that those who are working in forestry have to have their capacity built to understand gender issues. And this means that probably we should be collaborating with the Ministry of Gender and the department responsible for women, and strengthen links between KPK and these government agencies. All the people who are working in forestry should be able to understand the importance of addressing gender issues. Another important measure that can be taken is to publish forestry data and make sure that it's gender disaggregated. Put the data in inclusive formats so that women and other marginalized groups can be able to access the data and understand what it means. It's also important to have complaints mechanisms, and not just complaints mechanisms that are a form on the website, but make sure that they are mechanisms that can be accessed easily by women so that they can get justice if they experience abuse from forest guards, rangers, and other officials. It's very important to involve communities and especially women in planning and budgeting, and above all, to mainstream both gender and anti-corruption in the forestry sector strategic plan. This will ensure that both gender and anti-corruption concerns are addressed at sector level and enshrined in the sector strategic plan. And of course, KPK and all the others should enforce the law and continue to stop illegal logging and prevent its negative effects on the environment. NGOs also have a role to play. As we already saw, women's environmental NGOs are already very active in preserving the environment, but they need to do more to consider the role of corruption in destroying forests and other aspects of our environment. We encourage women's NGOs to take up the corruption issue as an important contribution to safeguarding the environment. Indeed, SPAC should get involved in forestry corruption. They should take it as a sector that's very important for, as the Honorable Commissioner already said, for all of us, for future generations, for the whole planet. It's so important to address this issue and stop forestry corruption. NGOs can advocate for women's participation in forest management and governance, and they can also play a role in monitoring what is going on in the sector through gender-aware and gender-balanced social accountability in activities. Private sector players also have a role to play. The most important thing, I think, is that the big multinational companies should ensure that a gender-sensitive approach is taken into account in their corporate compliance systems, that their codes of conduct are gender sensitive and take into consideration the concerns of women along forestry supply chains. They should also make an effort to involve more women in the forestry supply chain and to promote women-owned businesses. And, when we do research, we usually come back to the question of more research. Because when you do research, I guess you realize that there are many unanswered questions. So on the issue of gender and corruption, I think it's really important that we try to do more on gender and corruption in the forestry sector, try to find out exactly how men and women are involved along the forestry supply chain in corruption in both the public and the private sector. This way we will have the information that we need in order to develop appropriate strategies to address corruption in this area. We need also to conduct more studies and follow any initiatives to see what happens when we adopt a policy of involving more women in decision making. Will it indeed have an impact on corruption? And what conditions allow this in terms of democracy, economic conditions? Can we follow how involving women will decrease illegal logging and deforestation? And so with those remarks, I'd like to thank you again for allowing me to conduct this study. I hope that it will be the beginning of a new chapter for KPK in adopting a more gender-sensitive approach to corruption in the forestry sector. Thank you.
Baik, terima kasih Monica. Bapak dan Ibu, mungkin kalau melihat Monica tadi, bajunya keren banget. Batik ya Monica, itu seperti batik di Indonesia. Warnanya orange, adanya keren. Cerita, makanya bajunya keren sekali. Baik, Monica tadi sudah menyampaikan banyak hal mengenai penelitian yang sudah dilakukan. Jadi bagaimana perempuan harus terlibat mulai dari perencanaan, kemudian penganggaran dan beberapa rencana strategis untuk tata kelola di sektor kehutanan gitu ya. Dan Monica juga sempat tadi menyinggung sedikit mengenai gerakan perempuan di Indonesia, Saya Perempuan Anti Korupsi, dan juga dulu diinisiasi oleh KPK. Monica mungkin bisa memberikan sedikit penjelasan untuk SPAK Indonesia misalnya, ini gerakan perempuan yang sudah banyak bergerak di beberapa isu, tapi mungkin belum sampai masuk pada isu sektor lingkungan dan kehutanan. Kira-kira apa yang harus dilakukan pertama untuk bisa masuk dalam isu ini?
Was that a question to me? I don't think I activated the translation. So would you please translate for me? Thank you.
Monica, if I may step in and translate for you, can you hear me? So there's actually a little bubble, a world globe bubble at the bottom that comes with translation. But the question was, what can be done generally to activate women to become part of a movement, and you also were complimented on your batik, which I can share, I think, openly. We bought together when we were in Jakarta. So it is Indonesian batik Monica is wearing today.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I really love my batik, which I bought in Jakarta when I was there in 2019. and I wear it very proudly. What can be done to activate the involvement of women? I think that those of us women who are already in this, involved in addressing corruption, women who are already employed and working with NGOs, all of you women who are in KPK, SPAC, should reach out to our fellow women. We should reach out to them. I think that SPAC has a really good record on this one-on-one outreach, which is really an example for other women's movements. And I think this is how we should go about it. Follow the same model that SPAC is using, use languages and methods that women can understand, you know, use drama, use all these interesting techniques that SPAC is using, and just involve the women. But above all, let it be in the law that women should be part of initiatives. I think this is very important.
Oke, baiklah, terima kasih karena waktu juga sangat terbatas. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian yang mengikuti diskusi kali ini, kita sudah mendengarkan tadi paparan Monica. Untuk Bapak dan Ibu yang memiliki concern pada topik ini, nanti semua bahan penelitian, hasil penelitian bisa diunduh di website KPK maupun di websitenya U4. Jadi topik ini juga mengajak kita untuk memikirkan kembali agar tidak pernah melupakan pengarus utamaan gender dalam sektor kehutanan dan juga sektor-sektor lain dalam pemberantasan korupsi. Dan minggu depan beberapa rekomendasi yang tadi sudah dikemukakan oleh Monica akan diberikan kepada KPK untuk ditindaklanjuti, dan dari sini kita berharap bahwa banyak pihak yang nanti akan bisa terlibat untuk melakukan langkah-langkah lanjutan dan mendukung pelaksanaan rekomendasi yang sudah ada. Saya kira begitu saja. Terima kasih Bapak dan Ibu. Monica, terima kasih banyak. Sampai bertemu di Jakarta nanti. Monica sudah pengen sekali datang ke Jakarta. Semoga semuanya dalam keadaan sehat-sehat semuanya. Selamat sore. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Yuyu dan
Thank you
untuk sesinya. Untuk talk show sesi kedua, kami mengundang moderator Bapak Mark Valentino dari KPK dan Dr. Sobi Shute, Senior Advisor dari U4, dan peneliti studi tentang penanganan kasus korupsi kehutanan di Indonesia, pembelajaran dari proses penuntutan oleh KPK. Kepada Bapak Mark Valentino dan Sobi Shute, kami persilahkan.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Bernadette. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for finding time and visiting to this webinar. My name is Tino, and I'm investigator at KPK. The subtopic for current session is tackling prestige corruption in Indonesia. Lessons from KPK prosecutions. Our speaker is Sophie Ayon Schutte. I hope I'm spelling this right. She is a social scientist leading U4's work on corruption and anti-corruption measures in the justice sector, including anti-corruption agencies and special courts. She also coordinates U4's in-country workshops. Before coming to Bergen and U4 in 2013, she was an advisor for the Partnership for Governance Reform in Indonesia. She also worked for the Indonesian Corruption Eradication Commission, KPK, in Jakarta as an integrated expert. The KPK was the subject of her PhD thesis that she completed in 2012 in Melbourne, Australia. She also holds a master's degree in Southeast Asian Studies, Business and Economics, and Sociology from the University of Passau, Germany. Over the years, as a U4 advisor, she has had the fortune to do workshops and short-term assignment in many countries, including Afghanistan, Benin, Bhutan, Cambodia, Kenya, Kosovo, Malawi, Nepal, Tanzania, Thailand, Uganda, Ukraine, and Zambia. There's lots of countries. In this session, There will be no question and answers for audience, but it is me who have the privilege to ask our expert. But if you have questions, you can ask in our next technical discussion at 25th and 26th of November 2020. Looking forward to meet you there. Shall we begin? Sophie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I have a few questions. Firstly, what was the aim of your study and what did you want to find out?
Thank you. Ibu-ibu dan bapak-bapak yang saya hormati. I will continue in English. First of all, on behalf of U4, I would like to express my sincere gratitude towards GIZ and KPK for the special collaboration. I would like to thank Pak Laude Sharif for initiating this collaboration when he was still commissioner at KPK. In summer 2018, Pak Sharif and Pak Sulistianto actually made a detour from a conference in Oslo to come to Bergen in Western Norway to meet with you four and find out about possible ways to collaborate. And you linked us up with a terrific Litbank team at KPK. And here I would like to mention in particular Pak Sulis and Mas Fitra. Pak Sulis, what can I say? You are a walking Wikipedia on the Indonesian forestry sector. You and Mas Fitra have invested quite a lot of time in compiling the data we worked with, workshopping ideas and discussing drafts with us, providing comments on the papers and being reliable fact checkers. Tusen tak or 1,000 thanks, seribu terima kasih, as they say here in Norway. On behalf of all involved at U4, I would also like to thank GIZ, Ibu Francisca Silalai and her team, not just for funding a large part of this collaboration, but most importantly for genuinely being interested in the progress of the project, providing comments, sometimes nudging us when necessary, and being super responsive whenever we had questions or needed to overcome an obstacle. A lot of other people were involved in this relatively small project as well, and you find them, many of them acknowledged in the individual papers. One person, however, I would like to single out here is the translator of all three papers from English into Indonesian, Pak Ari Hasriyadi. Pak Ari, I hope you're watching. You probably know all three papers better than anyone because you translated every word. So if you have any questions, please ask Pak Ari. No, but seriously, let me answer your question, Patino, on the aim of the study. So the aim of our overall project was to explore what systematic analysis of KPK's case files, the berkas perkara, and the verdicts, the keputusan pengadilan, can provide in terms of insights for KPK's prosecution and prevention strategy. KPK and GIZ ask us to focus on cases related to the forestry sector because of its importance for Indonesia, but also for the rest of the world. The plan of this particular study, tackling forestry corruption in Indonesia, lessons learned from KPK prosecutions, was to explore how much analysis could be drawn from verdicts alone. And at a first workshop that we did together in May 2019, when we were still able to meet in person, we identified about 30 cases, that is 30 defendants, and it became quickly clear that we could not include the case files in the analysis as well, considering the size of the team, considering the size of the case files and our limited resources. So we decided that this study, we decided that one study would zoom in on one case and look at the case file in depth, and that is the social network analysis study that Dr. Jackie Baker is going to present. And the other study, the study written by Pak Laude and myself, would only look at the verdicts, but all of them. So we looked at 65 verdicts, that is 30 verdicts on first instance, then 20 appeal verdicts, and 15 cassation. And can you please go back in the slide? 15 cassation and judicial review verdicts by the Supreme Court. These verdicts, they came as image PDFs. So essentially, there were scans of the original verdicts that you cannot digitally search, but you have to scroll through them. And that these were hundreds and hundreds of pages. And this really put a limitation on what was feasible within the scope of the project. As the coding and the processing of the data was extremely time intensive. Therefore, we had to eventually limit the scope of this paper to a descriptive statistical analysis of the commonalities and the differences in the locus delicti, so the place where the crimes took place and the location of trial, the types of criminal charges that were brought against the defendants, the defendants' profiles, so like who was actually brought to court, who were these people, and their punishment, so the imprisonment, the fines, the restitutions, any assets that were recovered, as the punishment as it was requested by the KPK prosecutors in comparison with the sentences that were then actually handed down by the courts. So the study really only has been meant as an exploratory or a pilot study. And I believe we do have a better idea now of what is possible when studying only image scans of verdicts, but also what could be done if and what would make sense to look into further. And one thing that is, I think, is notable here is that towards the end of this project, so this summer in Europe, the Supreme Court in Indonesia revamped its website, its Putusan.net website, where it publishes its verdicts. And the verdicts that are uploaded there now are in optical character recognition format, an OCR format that can be processed a lot more efficiently. So a lot more should be possible now. If the lower court verdicts are also systematically included on Putusan.net. So I think there's a lot more scope now to do research more efficiently.
Yeah. I know your difficulties. You're examining thousands of pages of verdict. Yeah, I've seen that before. And what have you found out, and how did you manage it?
So, as I said, KPK has indicted more than 30 defendants involved in corrupt acts related to the unlawful issuance of licenses in the forestry sector. And the last of these cases obtained a verdict in 2016. So we looked at cases that really had a final and binding verdicts. And all these cases have in common that they resulted in deforestation and illegal commercial use of large areas of land in central Sulawesi, in East Kalimantan, in Riau, and in West Java. And our paper contains summaries of these cases and the name of all the defendants. But for the sake of time, I will now only report on some of the comparative aspects of these cases now. So maybe if you now could show the next slide. Nope, the one before that. Okay, go forward. Go forward. Yes. No, this one. Yeah, figure 3. So the crimes took place in 5 provinces, and with Riau and Jakarta very infamously leading with 10 and 9 defendants respectively. We found that members of parliament, the members of DPR, were entangled in the cases in the 4 provinces. And you see here a breakdown of the defendants' professions. All of them received prison sentences, But by now, most have already completed their sentences because, as I said, the last verdict was in 2016 and the average sentence was about 5 years. So with the regular reduction, the majority of them should probably be out of prison now. What we also found is that the companies benefiting from the corrupt deals were not fined and never lost their illegally obtained licenses. Now, if you can go back to the last slide, the figure 2 slide. Yes, so these were the main charges the defendants were charged with by KPK. So Law 31 from 1999 on corruption crimes, and it was amended by Law 20 of 2001, distinguishes between 30 different types of corrupt crimes. And in its indictments of the forestry defendants, KPK's main charges were abuse of power, bribery, gratuities, as you call gratifikasi in Indonesian, and in one case also obstruction of justice related to a bribery case. The public sector defendants, so the penyelenggara negara, that kind of were at the receiving ends of bribes and gratuities, they were indicted in the first 2 cases, the one in East Kalimantan and the first one in Riau. I must say that there were actually infamously 3 cases in Riau. So the first one in Riau, these cases, the penyelenggara negara, the public sector defendants, were all charged with abuse of power, causing losses to the state under Article 2(1). And for these charges, KPK had to provide evidence that first there was an unlawful act had taken place, so a law or regulation had been broken, that someone benefited from this unlawful act, and that it caused the state losses. This changed with the enactment of Law 18 of 2013 on the prevention and eradication of forestry destruction, because a special investigative unit was established under the Ministry of Forestry itself to investigate criminal acts in relation to forest destruction. And this also includes abuse of power by government officials. And so since then, since this new law in 2013, KPK prosecutions have focused on bribery and illegal gratuities as the main charges and no longer abuse of power. So since 2013, the public sector recipients in the cases in Central Sulawesi, the 2nd and 3rd Riau cases, and in West Java, were charged with the acceptance of illegal gratuities or gifts, so gratifikasi, not with bribery. KPK prosecutors maximized the potential punishment because the illegal gratuity charge under Article 12 puts the onus of proof on the defendants. The bribery charges under Article 5 and 11 were only made secondary charges. And this was actually quite a smart strategy and resulted in guilty verdicts for all those indicted. The defendants from the private sector, the 9 defendants from the private sector, they were all senior managers and directors of the involved companies. And they were charged with the bribery of state officials under Article 5. And these, the companies themselves, as I mentioned earlier, they were not charged, even though Law 30 of 1999, as amended by Law 20 of 2001, stipulates that corporations can be held liable for corrupt acts. And when I ask about this, so why weren't the companies indicted? One reason I was given by the KPK sources is that there was no criminal procedural law for indicting corporations before the enactment of a Supreme Court regulation in 2016. And this was actually after the final verdict in the cases that we were looking at in our study. So based on what it requested in its indictments, the KPK can be considered relatively successful. Its charges have largely been confirmed by the courts, even if the final prison sentences are on average. So for all 30, if you count all 30 defendants, the average verdict handed down by the courts in the end was 1 year lower than what KPK requested. If you could show the next slide, please. No, and the next, yes, this one. So this figure, this graph shows the sentencing at all level for all 30 defendants in order of the sentence lengths requested by the KPK prosecutors. So the light blue bar is what was proposed by the KPK prosecutors. The orange is the sentence that was handed down by the first instance court by the Pengadilan Negeri. Then the light green is from the appeals courts, the Pengadilan Tinggi, and the dark green is the sentence, the cassation sentence from the Supreme Court, from the Mahkamah Agung. So as you can see that here, half of the 30 defendants' cases went all the way to the Supreme Court, the dark green bars. And you can find all the defendants and their verdicts listed in the order of the sentences also in the annex of the paper. 10 cases were not appealed at all, and 5 cases stopped at the appeal level. And then the 15 cases were brought to the Supreme Court. That's, as I said, the dark green bar here. And of these 15, 4 were actually not cassation, but judicial reviews, so about procedural reviews of the cases. Another finding was that the KPK prosecutors requested restitution, so the payment of compensation, from only 5 defendants. And the court agreed in all 5 cases. And these were notably defendants in the first 2 cases, so in East Kalimantan and the first Rio case, in which the main charge was abuse of power causing losses to the state. So state loss needed to be established as part of the charges, and then restitution of losses could be requested. And to the best of my knowledge, none of the illegally obtained licenses in any of the cases discussed in this paper have been revoked until today. So overall, one could say that KPK has been quite successful in what it has done regarding these cases, at least going by the verdicts. It has secured convictions in all cases. It has imposed fines on the defendants and recovered some assets. But I would also say that it has not been so successful when it comes to the things that it has not done, if that makes sense. So we put it more elaborately in our paper. It is in the omission of charges against the benefiting companies, as well as the failure to request restitution of assets, full recovery of the proceeds of crime, plus damages for environmental degradation, that its indictments can be considered to fall short of the ideal. This has kept KPK from acting as the trigger of change that it has itself proclaimed to be.
Interesting. Yeah. Generally, some of research findings are not utilized properly. So, Sophie, how should your findings be followed up in practice? Do you have recommendations for KPK, other state authorities, researchers, or NGOs?
It's great that you're asking that. Can you show the next slide? So yes, in our paper, we have put forward several recommendations, in particular for the prosecution of forestry-related corruption cases. So since, as I said, we looked at the cases that were completed by 2016, and since then, only 2 more forestry-related cases have been indicted by KPK. We did not include them in the analysis, and they did not have a final verdict when this project started last year. And this, we find, stands in contradiction to KPK's efforts, preventive efforts, through the National Corruption Prevention Strategy and through KPK's support to the One Map and its sector studies. So one of our main recommendations is really that KPK should implement a coherent strategy of prevention and enforcement in the sector, and supported by a robust information and knowledge sharing infrastructure, especially internally, so that the prevention departments can also access some of the information that is gathered during investigations and prosecutions and vice versa, so that there is better collaboration and mutual strengthening between the preventive and the repressive functions of KPK. Next slide. Then our next recommendation is really that the companies should be indicted, that the companies that benefit from corrupt deals should be indicted. In fact, KPK has begun to pursue the companies benefiting from corrupt deals. And it has also begun to assign a value to the economic loss the state is suffering due to environmental degradation. The Nur Alam case is one example that we briefly also discuss in our paper. But in our view, the progress has been too slow, and this has hampered KPK's ability to show its value in terms of cost-benefit terms. Next slide. So we think that KPK should really put more emphasis on asset recovery and restitution. That is a difficult job, but an important job to put a number on the proceeds of crime. So really finding out the quantitative value of the proceeds of crime and reclaiming it for the state. Next slide. And then continue putting a value on environmental degradation as a state economic loss and request restitution for that. So when environmental damage is done, put a number on it and request a restitution. So maybe that some of it can also be restored in the future. Next slide. And demand the revocation of licenses. So if KPK itself cannot revoke the licenses, then demand the revocation of licenses by court. If the court has then determined that they have been obtained illegally, the companies should not be able to use these licenses any further. So maybe to sum up, in the future, the KPK should not only be proud of having a near perfect conviction record, but it should innovatively and bravely clear the legal path for prosecutions in the natural resource sector and set a precedent that also the other law enforcement agencies can follow. And when it comes to future research, so Monica has already presented some ideas, and I'm sure Jackie will also have some ideas. we think that it would be useful to apply the same kind of analysis that we did for these 30 forestry sector cases to all of KPK cases and see whether there are any particularities in the prosecution of forestry related cases, but possibly also any particularities in other sector cases. This takes a lot of time, even if verdicts are in a digitally processable format. And I would encourage KPK to seek collaboration with think tanks and universities in Indonesia. Initially, we had played with the idea to include also questions of efficiency and effectiveness of the investigation and prosecution process in the study. And also compare that with the Attorney General's office, who also has jurisdiction over corruption cases and including corruption cases in the forestry sector. But for this, more primary data is needed. So for example, the actual timelines for investigation and prosecution, the costs of the cases, so how much does it actually cost to investigate a case, the composition and the size of the investigation and the prosecution teams. So all this information, I think, should be made available to either internal researchers or external researchers to do a systematic analysis. And ideally, this would also be complemented by systematic trial monitoring by trained external observers. Trial monitoring would allow the assessments of compliance with due process and the rights of the defendants at court, as well as, very importantly, the capacity of the prosecution and the judiciary to thoroughly bring light into complex financial crimes and withstand political influence. And last but not least, I should say that in order to enable future research and thereby evidence-informed policy and strategy, the data needs to become much more accessible, both in terms of being available, being made available, but also being in a format that is easy to process further. And KPK needs a clear and open data and knowledge sharing policy across its directorates internally, but also to a certain degree, to the degree it's legally possible, sharing data externally. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Sophie. It's interesting that you said that KPK has been quite successful regarding the verdicts, but the problem is the omission of charges against the benefiting companies, as well as the failure to request restitutions of assets. I believe Mr. Laude would like to say something. Please, Mr. Laude.
Terima kasih. I will speak in bahasa Indonesia. Saya pikir apa yang dikatakan Sophie itu memang masih banyak pekerjaan rumah dari KPK. Salah satunya menyelesaikan kasus-kasus yang ikut terlibat di dalam kasus yang pasal 55 yang turut serta. Contoh, kasus Nur Alam. Nur Alam sudah masuk penjara, tetapi penyuapnya PT Harisma Barokah belum diapa-apain sampai hari ini. Ini apaan? Saya pikir ini harus segera ditindaklanjuti. Dan continue sekarang dia masih merusak di Sulawesi Tenggara. Yang tadi dikatakan bahwa ada kemajuan kita, tetapi perlu kita tingkatkan soal perusahaan. Kalau kita baca dari penelitiannya Ibu Jeki, Corruption Network, itu semua yang menyuap gubernur itu sebenarnya berhubungan dengan perusahaan-perusahaan besar, khususnya APP. Semuanya ada yang diakuisisi kemudian oleh mereka, ada yang dijadikan pemasok, semuanya, dan itu tidak terjangkau. Wah, ini kan sekali lagi saya ingin mendekatkan atau mendukung apa yang telah dikatakan oleh Ibu Sofi tadi, karena banyak pihak yang bertanggung jawab belum terjangkau. Jangan sampai kita dianggap tebang pilih seperti itu. Itu tidak boleh dilakukan. Karena kita semacam begini, akhirnya nanti kita dikatakan seperti itu, terus nanti tidak akan juga mengakibatkan perbaikan tata kelola di perusahaan itu. Karena kita seperti tidak serius untuk meminta pertanggungjawaban dari perusahaan-perusahaan yang mendapatkan keuntungan dari perbuatan tindak pidana korupsi. Terakhir, kasus yang kami tinggalkan, saya pikir sumber daya alam itu ada 3. Satu PT Palma 1, itu korporasi pertama di bidang sumber daya alam. Kedua, Kota Waringin dan Konawe Utara itu juga belum dilaksanakan. Jadi teman-teman tolong itu diselesaikan, karena jangan sampai terlupakan dan jangan sampai masyarakat beranggapan bahwa itu tebang pilih lagi. Seperti itu. Itu aja. Terima kasih banyak.
Ya, terima kasih pada Pak Laude. Okay, I think that's all. Tes, kedengeran? You hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Sophie, for your research study. Thank you for Mr. Laude. Hopefully, your recommendation could be implemented to improve Indonesian law, especially in the forestry sector. And for all of the participants, we will send you all the relevant links and files after the event, including slide presentations. Thank you. Silakan Mbak Bernadette.
Oke, siap. Terima kasih Bapak Mark Valentino, terima kasih Bu Sofi atas paparan dan diskusi yang sangat menarik. Sebelum kita memasuki sesi ketiga, sekali lagi kami informasikan acara diselenggarakan menggunakan 2 bahasa, yaitu bahasa Indonesia dan Inggris. Silahkan menggunakan fasilitas interpretasi yang ada di Zoom dengan klik di logo globe atau bola dunia di bagian bawah. Untuk bahasa Inggris, pilih English. Untuk bahasa Indonesia, pilih Indonesian. This event is held in 2 languages, Indonesian and English. Please use the interpretation facilities available in this Zoom platform by clicking on the globe logo at the bottom. To listen in English, select English. To listen in Indonesian, select Indonesian. Lalu untuk talk show yang sesi ketiga dan terakhir ini, kami mengundang moderator Bapak Sulistianto dari KPK dan Dr. Jackie Becker, dosen politik di Asia Tenggara dari Murdoch University, Australia, dan juga peneliti dari studi tentang jaringan korupsi di sektor kehutanan Indonesia, politik, dan pulp di Pelalawan Riau. Kami persilahkan.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Rere, Bapak Ibu sekalian, masih setia bersama kami ya Bapak Ibu. Ya, perkenalkan saya Sulistianto dari Direktorat Litbang, izin untuk memandu sesi ketiga kali ini. Ini hasil studi yang ketiga dari civil project yang kami kerjakan bersama UFOR di 2019. Bapak Ibu sekalian, kalau bicara kehutanan di Indonesia, seringkali kekuatan illegal logging itu dikaitkan dengan jaringan korupsi yang bekerja, gitulah. Nah, jaringan korupsi itu seperti apa? Karena banyak aktor yang terlibat, ada maklar, ada sektor swasta, ada kepala daerah dan aktor-aktor lain yang punya peran penting dalam jaring korupsi. Nah, tetapi bagaimana jaringan ini bekerja, kemudian siapa yang berperan dalam jaringan tersebut dan untuk melayani kepentingan siapa jaringan itu bekerja, secara gamblang nanti akan disampaikan oleh Dr. J.P. Becker dalam hasil studi jaringan korupsi di sektor kehutanan, politik, dan pulp di Pelalawan Riau. Namun sebelum Dr. J.P. Becker menyampaikan hasil studinya, Saya akan menyampaikan deskripsi singkat tentang Dr. Jackie Becker ini. Dr. Jackie Becker ini, beliau adalah dosen politik Asia Tenggara di Murdoch University, Australia. Dan bidang penelitiannya meliputi ekonomi politik Asia Tenggara, politik kepolisian dan korupsi, dan politik Indonesia. Nah, kalau Ibu tahu bahwa disertasi Dr. Jackie Becker ini terkait dengan kepolisian Republik Indonesia. Nah, saya pikir ini sangat menarik. Nanti kami minta Jackie menyampaikan poin-poin utama dari hasil studi. Itu yang pertama itu terkait dengan tujuan dari studi. Apa sih sebenarnya tujuan studi gitu ya. Terus kemudian metodologi yang digunakan itu apa? SNA sih, Social Network Analysis. Tapi seperti apa? Nanti akan kita simak. Terus kemudian temuan-temuannya juga nanti seperti apa? Sebagai bocoran itu dari social network analysis itu ditemukan sekitar 201 simpul dan kemudian ada sekitar 919 interaksi dalam proses jejaring korupsi nanti. Nah, Bapak Ibu sekalian, untuk mempersingkat waktu kami persilakan Dr. Jackie Becker untuk mempresentasikan hasil studinya. Waktu dan layar kami persilakan.
Thank you very much, Pat Solucio, and thank you very much for welcoming me to this seminar today. I extended a thank you also to Honourable KPK Commissioners, to Your Excellencies, the Ambassadors, and I want to extend a special thanks to GIZ, to KPK and Pat Laude, and particularly to you for sponsoring and supporting this research. It's been a great pleasure, and it's been a great ambition of mine to be able to do this work, and it's so exciting to be able to do it with you and in such a productive way. So I'll get on with it because I'm conscious that we are that there's quite a bit of work to get through. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that gets through. Is everyone able to see that? Yes. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, so I'll be presenting today on corrupt networks in the Indonesian forestry sector. And the aim of the study was to understand what these networks did and what they do, how they function, and why they're so resilient to prosecution. Now, I just want to back up a little bit and think a bit about corruption. Corruption is often understood in dominant terms, which are the principal agent theory. So the idea being a principal hires an agent, so like a boss and their official, their underling, who engages in corruption with a third party. So the corruption occurs sort of unbeknownst to the principal between the agent and the third party. So it's a very simple type of exchange. But this is very much the dominant way that we understand corruption. Now, in cases of systematic corruption or institutionalized corruption, this principal agent sort of structure is replicated again and again and again. However, there are other ways of thinking about corruption, and that was one of the ways we were trying to think about with this paper. And that's the idea that corruption is perhaps networked, and that maybe there are networks of actors who are conjoined around the pursuit of material interests. And it seems to me that reviewing the KPK's forestry cases that it has prosecuted, as Sophie and Pat Laude pointed out, there's been something around 27 cases prosecuted, but those cases revolve around 6 different key cases. So it seems that the KPK has been pursuing in many ways a kind of network approach to understanding corruption in the forestry sector. So the KPK is certainly looking at cases, looking at networks of individuals and prosecuting key individuals. And the way that we talk about that in the literature is to kind of decapitate the network. I apologize for the sort of slightly crude language, but the idea is if you pull out the kind of key actors of that network will collapse. Now, the way that the KPK is pursuing corruption in the forestry sector really resonates as well with what academia says is happening as well in the forestry sector. Now, for those of you familiar with Professor Vedi Hadiz's work, he's written a lot about how networks of political authority and economic interest underpin the Indonesian political system. He calls this oligarchy, and oligarchy theory has really defined how we understand Indonesian politics. Drilling down further into the forestry sector, there's a kind of clear conclusion of the literature, which is that corrupt forestry networks are often being driven by political elites in league with bureaucratic actors who are selling the the authorities of public office, the ability to give licenses to the private sector. And they're doing this in part or largely because of campaign financing. So decentralization and democratization is driving deforestation. And so this is very much what the literature is arguing about, why deforestation is occurring and why it's being driven by corruption. I will add just quickly that there's some new work coming out by Professor Ed Aspel at ANU and Wouter Berenschot at Leiden University, and they're arguing that corruption in the natural sectors, natural resource sector, particularly the forestry sector, is worse because it's a monopoly type power. So these are what they call mafia networks. And they argue that corruption in other sectors, particularly in urban sectors or other economic sectors, are more transactional and that the networks are more volatile. So the argument here is because we're dealing with a natural research sector, the networks are stronger, they're more resilient, and they're very collusive. Whilst in urban corrupt networks, there's a greater dispersal of economic power, and so potentially these networks are more vulnerable. So I'm going to just shelve that conclusion, we'll talk about it a bit later on, but this is just to say that there is a real conclusion in the literature that forestry networks are corruption in the forestry networks are being driven by local level elites in league with bureaucrats and the private sector, often around licensing and land use. So what were my research questions? Is corruption in the forestry sector networked? What do those networks look like? How are roles organized?
Jackie, maaf.
Yeah.
Slide presentasinya bisa di.
Oh, any to share? Maaf Pak, ini tidak di-share ya? You share?
Ya, sekarang sudah kelihatan.
Okay, sorry.
Sudah.
Okay, so is corruption in the forestry sector networked? What do they look like? Are the most powerful people in that network those who have political power, or are there other kinds of actors? And did the KPK's corrupt prosecution strategy effectively decapitate the network, as we were talking about before? And finally, what can a network approach tell us about the resilience and endurance of corruption in the forestry sector? So I'll just talk a little bit about the method. For this particular study, as Sophie said, there's quite a lot of data amongst these files. So I really had to drill down into one case study. And for that case study, I looked at Tengku Azman Jafar, who is the Bupati of the newly created district of Pelalawan in province in Riau. He was the Bupati from 2001 to 2007, very much a kind of product of Indonesia's democratic decentralization. Aided by a sort of middle manager in the local forestry department, Tengku Azman Jafar illegally gave licenses to 15 different companies, aided by his forestry executive, Budi Sulami. So he sold these licenses to enable timber supply companies to log forest. 7 of those timber supply companies were his own companies. So those were companies set up and directed by his wife and daughter and son and brother and other members of his kinship network. But the other companies were actually aligned to big conglomerates. So there were 7 Jafar-affiliated companies, and they were ostensibly had work contracts with PT Rap, which is under April, which is a Raja Garuda Mas subsidiary, working in pulp and paper. There were also 2 other companies that received these licenses, and they were affiliated to Asian Pulp and Paper. So these were companies that are independent, but they sell their timber to these giant pulp processors, which are in Riau. And so pulp is a really important part of the story of how this corruption took place. Ultimately, the logging that took place was, the court decided, cost the state $128 million. So it was quite a significant sum. I should also add that the prosecution was unable to locate a key witness or a key actor in this network, and that was Rossmann, who was the general manager of PT Rap. While the court agreed that the corruption had occurred in a collaborative manner, that there was collective corruption had occurred in this case, it wasn't just Tunku Azman Jafar working alone, prosecutors were unable to locate the head of PT Rap, Rossmann. And that is sort of continues to be a big black hole in this case. Affiliated to this case, the KPK also prosecuted 3 heads of the provincial forestry department. They prosecuted the governor of Riau, so Rusli Zainal, and another district head of Siak. So it was quite a network that was formed through this case. And the KPK, to its credit, really vociferously pursued all of the state actors, bureaucratic and political actors associated with the case. So in many regards, we might say, the KPK really went out on a limb to really root out corruption in the forestry sector in Riau. Now,
Jeki, maaf, Jeki, sorry.
Ya.
Biar biar slide-nya bisa dilihat lebih luas, bisa di slideshow.
Oh, okay, sip. Sorry. Thank you.
Ya, oke, terima kasih.
Yeah. Great. So to this case, I applied social network theory, and I'm not going to talk too long about what that is, but basically it's a type of sort of analysis that that allows us to map relationships between actors. And it allows us to map those relationships in different ways. So we can measure how dense is a network, or how coherent is a network, or how spread out is a network, or how does resources move through a network? Who are the key brokers in the network? So there are multiple ways of analyzing using social network analysis. And for this presentation, I'm only going to show you one way that we analyze this network. And that was in terms of the most important relationships. So how did I get this data? What I did was I took the BRP, which is the investigative, sort of the criminal investigation report. I mapped all of the evidence that the prosecutors had collected for this case, the investigators had collected for this case, and I mapped all of the interactions that I read through testimonies of the persons interviewed for the case. And what I did then was reduce all of that data to a simple to and from kind of matrix. So every kind of interaction, every time Jafar called Rossmann, for instance, it was from Jafar to Rossmann, and that was marked as an interaction. Every time there was a letter processed, every time a license was processed, in essence, I boiled that down to a to from interaction. When there was a group meeting, I found a different way of mapping it, and I can talk a bit more about that later. But what we did was through that process of mapping, we mapped that there were 900 plus interactions. And then we effectively feed these interactions into into the social network analysis software. And that produces images and analysis and data with which we can understand the network. So that's a kind of a short summary of what social network analysis does. So it's best to understand that the images you see are only one way of understanding these sets of interactions. And I also did quite a significant political economy analysis, looking at what was the kind of context, the political and economic context in which these networks arose. So looking at how was pulp being regulated at the time, what was pulp's relationships to the federal government, to the central government, what were the kinds of political machinations and financing machinations that were happening at the time. And that's really important because I think one problem with social network analysis is it seems to sort of suspend networks apart from the wider context. And if there's one thing to take away, I think it's to understand that the regulatory or structural environment in which it really shapes that network. And so this is in part a reason why the work that prevention does is so important to understanding how corruption, so the work that prevention does in the KPK will really structure how these networks are produced, how they function, their volatility and their resilience. So it's about understanding both the network and the wider context in which they work, in which they are produced. So what did I discover? Let's go back to those questions. Is it networked? How do those networks look like? How is material gains organised? Who are the most powerful people? And did the KPK target the right people? So as a broad picture, yes, we can say that forestry corruption in the case of Tunku Usman Jafar was indeed networked. I identified 201 individuals who were either willingly or unwittingly part of this corruption network. They played a function in the network. Of those nodes, there was also 92 organisations that were part of this. Often they were pulp companies. There were 919 interactions between those actors, between the actors that created that network, and the network went from 2000 to 2007. Monica reminded me that I have not been very good on my gender analysis and that I didn't break down my actors by gender. However, I'll add, just from knowing the data well, that there were quite a number of female actors in this network. They made up probably about 20 to 30% of the network. And those actors ranged from people within Jafar's kin network, so like his wife or his best friend or so forth, people who played, who you might say have intimate relationships with Jafar, but also they played really important roles as grey level actors. And what I mean by grey level actors is they're not necessarily the primary architects or organisers of the scheme, but they play really, really important roles in enabling the scheme. And so I did see quite a number of women as accountants, as lawyers, as surveyors, enabling the corruption to take place. So women were most certainly present within this network. Now, the network overall as a structure was primarily made up of people from the pulp industry. After that were district forestry officials, people within Jafar's kin relationship, so his trust network. That means his family and his friends were 17 of the nodes. There were other elements of the private sector, so building contractors, surveyors and so forth. They made up another percentage of the network. I'll draw your attention to the other line there who made up 12% of the network. These were individuals like political party officials, civil society organisations, media, these kinds of sort of central parts of society who were also part of this network, in many cases very complicit members of this network. So it's important to see the network is quite broad, as dominated by pulp, and is much, much larger than the number of people who ultimately get prosecuted, and made up of quite a number, as I said, of grey actors who play key enabling functions for the network. So my next slide is the kind of social network analysis. And this slide shows us what are the key relationships that are happening in this corrupt network. So you can see there's all 210 slides there. They're organised by profession. And you can see that the key relationships that are at work in this network is the relationship between the Bupati, Tunku Azman Jafar, who was prosecuted, and Budi Solani, the middle-ranking forestry official who helped him with his scheme. I should add, Budi Solani became a witness for the KPK and was a whistleblower for the KPK. But he was in many ways Tunku Azman Jafar's right-hand man. So naturally we see a key number of relations, so that's the core relationship dominating this network. The second set of relationships I want to draw your attention to is the relationship between number one, who is the triangle, that's Jafar, and these green circles down on sort of the right-hand side. That's number 45, 47, 44. These were also individuals that the KPK prosecuted. They were heads of the Provincial Forestry Service. And they were also very important elements of the network that played key relationships. Another point to notice about the shape of that network is that 45, 47, and 44 basically control that bottom half corner of that network. So if Budi or Jafar want to communicate to what are primarily pulp industry individuals, they have to go through those provincial level heads. So this is what we call as modularity, meaning that there's a modular section of the network that is controlled by certain individuals. And that's a really key characteristic of corruption networks. And it's often associated with government functions, the monopoly process over licenses. So that element of the network is really, really important. You can also see, for instance, I'll draw your attention to number 51, who is one of the ministers, a former minister of forestry. He's up in the number, he's a yellow colour up in the left-hand corner. And in order for Jafar to access the minister, he goes through a pulp actor. And so you can often see these kinds of relationships being brokered by private sector. So it's not that all of government have relationships with each other, but pulp sector actors are brokering these relationships. Another really interesting finding I found through this network was that in this forest of nodes, I started to see other little parasitic relationships sort of forming up and around this corrupt network. So there was a set of relationships emerging between 3, who is the star at the bottom right-hand corner, and 147, and what's the other numbers there? 78, 148. So these are people who don't actually have any relationship to the corrupt network, but who people are bringing into the corrupt network and distributing money to. So in some ways we might say networks kind of breed other networks, and you start to see kind of parasitic networks attaching onto this sort of movement of money. There was real gatekeeping power in our other categories. So you remember in the slide before, there was other nodes that were marked as other. They were, there were gatekeepers, I'll just start again. There were gatekeepers who were departmental accountants, gatekeepers from PT RAP. There was a lender of money to Jafar, who was from the palm oil sector. And these people also played quite important parts of the network, even though, and that was something that network analysis presented, even though they didn't really see, it wasn't really something obvious from the testimonies or from the evidence. So that these relationships really emerged as quite important, even though they were sort of unobservable from the qualitative data of the testimonies. It's important to note that most of these people within this network eluded prosecution. And not all were, of course, complicit. Many were unwittingly complicit or were lower level functionaries just doing what their bosses told them to do. An important thing to notice was, an important thing about sort of corrupt networks is that they're often, one of the key things we study about them is how they respond to law enforcement and how they respond to a hostile environment. The idea is that these networks are trying to keep themselves hidden, and they're trying to evade investigation. And that was something that is a real key element of the literature of corrupt networks. But what I found with this particular network was this simple structure of 1 being connected to 2, and that little green structure of 44, 47, 45 was quite a visible structure. And so in many ways, it was really exceptional in the corruption literature because these people are so obvious, their roles. Ordinarily in a criminal network, the key architects of a network are not necessarily the most visible in a network. You might get proxies or brokers acting for them. So somebody who is trying to evade detection will actually reduce their number of contacts and push someone else forward in order that they evade detection. In this particular network, that's not at all evident. In fact, Jafar is really the center of his network. Budi is his second in charge. The other individuals who were prosecuted from the provincial forestry department are also very present. And what this suggested to me was that this was a very simplistic and quite unsophisticated criminal network. And in many ways, that resonates with the context of the time, wherein we had the kind of big bang decentralization. There was unclear authority between the forestry department in Jakarta and in Riau. And so, local forestry departments were just ploughing ahead selling licenses. And so in many ways, this is a network that felt it was completely immune from prosecution. This was a network that didn't sense itself as being policed either by the police or by the forestry department or by the central authorities in Jakarta. This was a network operating in full sight. And this brings us back to the question of, back to the issues around the political economy analysis, and wherein, a history of pulp in Indonesia highlights what a privileged industry this is, how it's had privileged access to Jakarta level elites, how it's had privileged access to state level finance. And it's in many ways a sector that has been nurtured by the centre. And Jafar, in his sort of concluding defence statement, said, I only did this because I thought this was something that Jakarta wanted. Now, of course, we can read this quite cynically and say, well, you were profiting from this. But he was in many ways engaging in what he thought was the ancillary work of nurturing the pulp industry in Riau. And so this brings us to the conclusion that actually these networks are really formed in relationship to the wider structural context. And they see, and that these elites, even though they're driving the corruption, they are seeing the underlying privileged position of this industry, and they're just kind of attaching themselves onto it. So while we say that Jafar was kind of the key architect, in fact, Jafar himself, was prosecuted for these crimes, but the companies that he formed, the companies that illegally obtained these licenses, and their parent companies, the pulp processors, were never prosecuted, and in fact continue to operate with total impunity. They continue to be, these companies continue to supply pulp to PT Rap. This supply is, in many ways, it appears to be an independent timber supply company, just supplying timber to the pulp processors. But in fact, these pulp processors are deeply embedded in the creation of these companies and orchestrating these companies. So in many ways, Jafar, I think, was the fall guy for a system that ultimately became embedded, a system of informal vertical integration of pulp, wherein timber suppliers are effectively owned by the pulp company, and they provide timber at cheaper rates, without at cheaper rates to pulp companies. but whilst pulp companies can continue that legal separation. So by not taking away the licenses for these companies and not pursuing the pulp processors who are the ultimate architects of this scheme, or the ultimate beneficiaries of this scheme, the networks, even though you take out the key individuals, governors, bupatis, heads of department, these networks continue because the ultimate beneficiaries are still in place. And in fact, what started out as Jafar's small scheme really became, seems to have become a structural and embedded characteristic of the underlying pulp industry. So it's not just PT RAP that has benefited, but also PT IKPP under Asian Pulp and Paper. It's effectively a norm under which the pulp industry operates. And this is all on the basis of these illegal licenses being produced by local leadership and the bureaucracy. So how should findings be followed up? In many ways, I think this is open to a broader conversation with the KPK, with civil society, with various stakeholders in the forestry, with the forestry department. But I guess there's a few conclusions that I made. Like Sophie and Pat Laude, there's a real need to focus on the private sector and beneficial owners of these companies, and that, following the money, seizing assets, seizing licenses, this is really the way to tackle this underlying networked corruption. Decapitating networks is not going to, only is a temporary band-aid on what is a really entrenched system. It's important to note for our prevention department within KPK that the work that department does really gives shape and form to how these networks are able to operate. So understanding that how a sector is regulated and really trying to look at the governance of that sector and make recommendations around that sector is really, really critical to eradicating corruption in that sector. And finally, just to talk sort of more widely about the huge number of individuals that are involved in corruption networks, and there's the grey actors from surveying companies and accounting companies and legal companies that really enable this corruption to take place. I think that it's very difficult to say, well, let's prosecute all of them. There's no way, if the KPK was to try and prosecute all 201 people in this one network, we'd still be in prosecution 20 years later. And so I think there's a need to lean out into wider society and to encourage other forms of sanction, professional sanction. And that means maybe reaching out to professional bodies or certification bodies and saying, look, these people were involved in this network. There must be processes of ethical sanction or license revocation that we can enact at a sectoral or professional level. And I think that's something that is not just in the responsibility or the remit of the KPK, but is something that civil society can advocate on, that the private sector can advocate on. And again, that's really hitting these people where it hurts. It's taking away their means of remuneration. It's taking away their status within society, and it will really disencourage this kind of enabling activities. Finally, as a researcher, of course, I've always got interest in furthering research agenda. I think that this was a wider, in this research, I was only able to map the one case of Tunku Azman Jafar. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, there were a number of other people prosecuted by the KPK. It'd be very interesting to see if I was to map all of the interactions involved in those criminal investigation files, what the network would look like there. We were just looking at the Jafar's network, but we've also got 5 other prosecutions attached to this case. And so there's some other questions we might ask in terms of the comparison of networks. So this network was generated at the start of Indonesia's decentralization process, which we might say was quite a chaotic period wherein authority was not clear between the regions and the center. Many of those issues have been clarified in subsequent legislation. We could actually look at comparing Jafar's early network, the sort of proto network, with other networks that have been detected post-regulatory changes, and see whether those networks are more volatile, more dynamic, engage different groups of people. We can compare different networks and look at what is the impact of regulatory change on corrupt networks. How does it displace, change their functions, and so forth? We can similarly ask about increased law enforcement. When there has been a pressure on the sector in terms of in law enforcement, how have networks responded? Finally, to return to the question I posed at the start of this presentation, which was we could also compare whether this is a real function of natural resources, of the natural resource sector, and whether we could compare this to other kinds of sectors like waste or urban kinds of corrupt networks, and see whether in fact Aspinall and Berenschot's kind of empirically driven conclusion that corrupt networks in more diversified economies are more volatile, and that this is really a quirk of the natural resource sector that we get such deep and resilient corrupt networks. So that's another element of comparison we could take on. So I'll finish up there. I'm conscious of time, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Ya, terima kasih Jeki, presentasi yang luar biasa dan sangat menarik Bapak Ibu sekalian. Jadi tadi selain metodologi, terus kemudian menggambarkan jaringan korupsi gitu ya untuk kasus Tengku Asmun Jafar gitu ya. Dari hasil studi juga banyak disampaikan rekomendasi baik itu untuk internal KPK gitu ya, artinya pencegahan dan penindakan terintegrasi begitu ya. Tapi juga tadi diusulkan untuk agenda-agenda riset ke depan gitu yang bisa dilakukan dari hasil studi kali ini gitu ya. Saya lihat di feature attendees tadi ada Pak Roy dari Dirjen Gakum KLHK, apakah masih di room? Host bisa dibantu atau dikasih akses? Halo Mbak Siska, apakah Pak Roy masih di room? Dan tolong dikasih akses untuk memberikan komen atas hasil studi dari Jeki.
Ya, Pak Roy sudah menjadi salah satu panelis, Pak. Silahkan. Oh, nggak ada. Masih ada di panelis. Oh, jadi tinggal di unmute aja mic-nya.
Oke. Halo Pak Roy. Halo Pak Roy. Pak Roy masih ada di room? Atau sudah nggak ada?
Masih ada tapi mikrofonnya masih mute ya?
Nggak bisa di unmute.
Harus host, dari harus dari sananya Pak.
Oke. Halo Pak Roy. Oke, baik Bapak Ibu sekalian, kelihatannya Pak Roy sudah meninggalkan room gitu ya. Tadi Jiki Baker sudah menyampaikan bagaimana studi dilakukan, metodologi yang dipakai gitu ya. Memang untuk studi-studi korupsi terutama di KPK pun itu belum pernah gitu ya menggunakan metodologi social network analysis gitu ya. Dan ini merupakan suatu temuan yang luar biasa gitu ya, bagaimana kita bisa mengidentifikasi jejaring korupsi dan bekerjanya gitu ya. Karena kalau dilihat dari dokumen pemeriksaan gitu ya, sebenarnya banyak aktor yang ada di situ gitu yang punya peran penting, tapi kemudian belum jadi perhatian para penyidik KPK gitu ya. Nah ini penting ke depan bagaimana kemudian kita bisa mengidentifikasi jejaring itu dan kemudian pemberantasan korupsi itu bisa diorientasikan kepada melemahkan jejaring atau menghilangkan jejaring korupsi tadi. Karena kalau kemudian kita hanya ngejar berapa aktor gitu ya, selama jejaring itu masih tetap eksis, saya pikir korupsi juga akan tetap eksis gitu ya. Nah, Bapak Ibu sekalian, karena di forum ini memang tidak ada sesi tanya jawab gitu ya. Tapi saya pikir Bapak Ibu dan teman-teman sekalian sudah banyak pertanyaan yang ada di benak gitu ya. Tapi jangan kecewa gitu ya. Soalnya nanti masih ada sesi di tanggal 24 sama 25 gitu ya, untuk kita bisa diskusi secara detail gitu ya, mulai dari metodologi dan rekomendasi ke depan begitu ya. Demikian yang bisa saya sampaikan Bapak Ibu sekalian untuk sesi ketiga hasil studi kerjasama KPK dan U4 dalam proyek File. Dan terima kasih atas kehadiran Bapak Ibu sekalian, dan terima kasih sekali atas J.K. Baker atas usaha kerasnya untuk menyelesaikan studi, karena saya tidak membayangkan membaca 2000 halaman dokumen pemeriksaan begitu ya. Dan sekali lagi terima kasih kepada Bapak Ibu semua.
Assalamualaikum
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Mas Sulis, maaf,
Ya.
Pak Rasio udah ada di.
Oh, Pak Rasio ada?
Iya.
Oke. Oke, baik. Halo Pak Roy, apa kabar? Halo Pak Roy. Pak Roy di room?
Mikrofonnya mohon di unmute, Pak.
Ya, Mas Sulis.
Ya, halo apa kabar Pak Roy?
Sehat Pak? Baik, saya ngikutin kok Mas Sulis.
Nah. Oh ya, siap.
Siap.
Ya Pak, jadi untuk mengembangkan upaya-upaya pemberantasan korupsi ke depan, terutama di sektor kehutanan, kami berkolaborasi dengan U4 Resource Center gitu ya, untuk melakukan studi berdasarkan ini Pak, dokumen-dokumen kasus korupsi yang ditangani KPK yang sudah inkrah begitu ya. Jadi tadi dari Sofi juga sudah menyampaikan terkait dengan lesson learned dari proses penindakan gitu ya. Terus kemudian Jeki dengan studi jaringan korupsi di sektor kehutanan itu mencoba menganalisis lebih dalam gitu ya dari dokumen penanganan kasus gitu ya. Tadi disampaikan bahwa sebenarnya korupsi itu membentuk sebuah jaringan, Pak. Jadi tadi juga disampaikan banyak aktor-aktor sebenarnya yang disebut dalam pemeriksaan gitu, tapi kemudian tidak dituntut gitu ya. Padahal aktor tadi punya peran penting dalam proses berjalannya korupsi gitu ya. Terus kemudian ada juga izin-izin yang tidak prosedural gitu ya, yang seharusnya mungkin juga harus dicabut gitu ya. Karena sebenarnya dalam proses penanganan kasus korupsi itu juga izin-izin itu diperoleh oleh proses yang korup gitu ya. Nah, tapi kemudian izin-izin itu masih beroperasi gitu ya. Dan seperti yang disampaikan Jackie, izin-izin dan kemudian aktor-aktor lain itu sebenarnya yang kemudian mendukung bagaimana jejaring itu bisa eksis dan tetap berjalan. Ada ini Pak, komentar terkait dengan studi-studi tadi Pak Roy, monggo silakan.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Sulis. Tadi saya juga mengikuti beberapa presentasi yang ada tadi. Bagi kami ini kan satu masukan ya, bagaimana kita membangun proses tata kelola dan juga upaya-upaya penegakan hukum. Tentu beberapa penelitian yang dilakukan berkaitan dengan kegiatan penindakan korupsi Indonesia juga bisa menjadi model dan pembelajaran bagi kami di dalam melakukan upaya-upaya penegakan hukum berkaitan dengan kejahatan lingkungan hidup dan kehutanan. Kami selalu mengatakan bahwa ini kejahatan luar biasa karena juga kejahatan ini kompleks dalam arti kata juga karena interlinkage dengan beberapa kejahatan termasuk korupsi, pencucian uang dan maupun kejahatan lainnya. Bagi kami ini satu masukan Mas Sulis ya, tentu juga akan menjadi pembelajaran bagi kami di dalam menindaklanjuti menangani kejahatan kehutanan termasuk juga menindaklanjuti dari temuan-temuan yang ada. Saya pikir itu Pak Sulis.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Roy. Jeki ada yang mau disampaikan untuk Pak Roy? Jeki?
I guess I have a question both for Pak Roy and for you as well, Pak Sulis. I mean, to what extent is it really is it really possible to prosecute everyone that's involved in a network? And what might be other ways of pursuing corrupt actors in ways that are outside of the formal criminal justice sector? Do you pursue those actors in that way, and what opportunities do you see for that?
Yes, I think this is there are some opportunities when we conducted more deeper investigation in order to develop to finding the network itself. We also can see that, for example, there is many interlinked crime as well, also the network crime itself. For example, many people they conduct, for example, illegal logging, and then illegal logging will transform the land encroachment. And then after that, maybe they conduct land encroachment for illegal mining. And then from illegal mining, they will go to illegal plantation. It could be the transformations of the crime, and also the network, the networks that they have to support their criminal activities. I think this is, we find this kind of thing also. And then we learn how can we stop this? And then what kind of instrument we can use it? And then we thanks also for the KPK. KPK also part of our network in fighting against the criminal network. I think if I always remember what Pak Laudis Sarip mentioned, that if the criminals can collaborate, why don't we can collaborate better to stop this kind of networks can develop bigger and bigger. I think this is what we have to do it. And then actually, thanks to your presentation, and we can get this lesson learned from scientific point of view, I think. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Roy. Ya, sebenarnya kami juga udah mengarah ke sana, Jeki, ya, bagaimana kemudian korporasi itu udah mulai masuk target gitu ya. Nah, terus kemudian penting juga sih sebenarnya nanti treatment terkait dengan para makelar yang membantu proses bekerjanya jejaring gitu ya. Treatmentnya seperti apa yang bisa dilakukan. Terus kemudian dengan izin-izin yang diterbitkan dengan proses-proses unprocedural tadi itu juga seperti apa kemudian harus di-treatment. Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, tapi memang waktunya terbatas dan kita memang menyediakan untuk sesi diskusi yang lebih panjang dan lebih dalam gitu ya di tanggal 24 dan 25 gitu ya. Dengan sangat menyesal saya harus mengakhiri sesi ini. Sekali lagi terima kasih Pak Roy, Jeki, dan Bapak Ibu sekalian atas kehadirannya dalam acara hari ini, dan saya kembalikan ke Mbak Rere. Silakan Mbak Rere.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Sulis, Bu Jeki, dan Pak Roy.
Ya, terima kasih Mbak Rere.
Demikian acara peluncuran virtual hasil kajian U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center dan KPK tentang korupsi di sektor kehutanan. Untuk link materi paparan hari ini dan makalah dapat dilihat di chat box ya. Baik, lalu acara selanjutnya adalah tanggal 24 dan 25 November. Lalu di internal KPK akan dilakukan pemberian rekomendasi hasil studi secara resmi kepada pimpinan KPK di tanggal 27 November 2020. Terima kasih atas kehadiran Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Sampai bertemu di rangkaian acara selanjutnya. Salam anti korupsi.
Salam. Terima kasih, Mbak.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Sulis. Terima kasih semuanya. Terima kasih.